Good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Slifkin, and I am the Director of Graduate Studies and a professor here at the Institute of Fine Arts. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second Aperture IFA photo assembly. Aperture and the Institute of Fine Arts have partnered to establish a series of conversations that center photography as a creative act and means of responding to urgent questions in the world around us. With this program, we aim to foster a critical yet community-oriented environment for reflection and learning by creating a forum for exchange on why photography matters. As a point of departure, we will look toward the fall 2023 issue of Aperture magazine, Accra, and we have esteemed panelists Lyle Ashton Harris, Amy Sall, Ama Agyemang Asante, and Kwame Anthony Appiah will each share brief 5-minute presentations to generate an open conversation, which will immediately be followed by a discussion with the audience. And we encourage all of you to participate. That's one of the things that we are dedicated to with this forum, that it truly is a forum. So after, we're keeping the presentation short, and we're hoping the conversation is quite generative. For those of you who might not be familiar with Aperture, they are a nonprofit publisher that leads conversations around photography worldwide. From its base in New York, Aperture connects global audiences and supports artists through its acclaimed quarterly magazine, books, exhibitions, digital platforms, public programming, limited edition prints, and awards. Established in 1952 to advance creative thinking, significantly expressed in words and photographs, Aperture champions photography's vital role in nurturing curiosity and encouraging a more just, tolerant society. The Institute of Fine Arts is a thriving center for advanced research and graduate teaching in art history, archaeology, and art conservation through NYU. A site of knowledge production since its founding in 1932, the Institute has also produced many of the world's leading art historians, museum directors, curators, and conservators. And one of the things that I'm most excited about this collaboration with Aperture is having the Institute bring together scholars working in photography across NYU, not just at the Institute. And so I'm particularly delighted to have my colleagues from Steinhardt in the Department of Philosophy as part of the panelists tonight. So thank you, everyone. And now I'll pass it over to Michael Famighetti, Editor-in-Chief at Aperture, to introduce our distinguished speakers.
Thank you very much, Rob. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining this evening. My name is Michael Famighetti. I'm the editor of Aperture, and I just want to say thanks for IFA and NYU for hosting us. Last month, we published our autumn edition of the magazine titled Accra, which is part of a series of issues that we produce that delve into photographic practices and histories in or connected to a particular international city. Past editions have focused on Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Delhi, Los Angeles, and Mexico City. In addition, in 2017, we published an issue called Platform Africa, an issue that focused on the network of festivals, educational centers, and experimental art spaces that have propelled photography on the continent since the 1990s, looking at the Bamako Biennale to the Market Photo Workshop in Johannesburg. The idea for the Accra issue came from the artist, friend, and Aperture trustee, Lyle Ashton Harris. Lyle had been approached by Aperture about a project connected to Paul Strand. Strand had been invited to Ghana by Kwame Nkrumah in the early 1960s to make photographs of an independent nation. From that conversation, the idea for this issue took shape, with Lyle enlisting the Ghana-based photographer and educator, Nii Obadai, to collaborate with him as guest editors. Nii isn't here today, but he is an amazing force who we were privileged to work with. The issue presents a wide range of stories and portfolios that reflect contemporary practices, ongoing research and curatorial work, and profiles of new spaces supporting photographers and lens-based artists in Accra. We were actually pleased to host a launch and related panel discussion at Accra's new Daikon Center a couple of weeks ago, which was especially resonant given that the majority of the issue's contributors are based in Ghana. Thank you to Daikon's founder, Paul Ninsen, the writer, Anakwa Dwamina, and Matt Tierney for working with us to make that special event possible. As Lyle notes in the issue's introduction, Quote, I wanted to collaborate with NI to produce a conduit that would bring viewers into the fertile intellectual history and contemporary social landscape of Accra. In that same text in the issue, Obadiah underscores the idea that, quote, photography is a potent medium for situating history, end quote. That history is held in the many physical photography archives within Accra, profiled in the issue, and also in the collaborative archives assembled by artists on social media platforms. This work is shaping a collective understanding of history and identity that may otherwise be lost. And across the pages of the issue, we see how artists are often the link between the past and the present, as in Zora Opoku and Lloyd Foster's multimedia projects about the diaspora, as well as Carlos Idan Tawia's profiles of subcultures and fashion trends, which frequently reference legendary West African image makers from the 1960s and 70s, to mention just a couple of features. And Carlos's work is on the cover of the magazine. I want to thank Lyle and Ni for being such fantastic guest editors and for bringing their visions, hard work, and spirit of collaboration to this edition. I also want to thank our incredible panelists for joining us tonight to discuss their contributions to the issue and the larger scope of their rigorous research and thinking as it relates to images, archives, and Ghana's role in the global imagination. Lyle Ashton Harris has cultivated a diverse artistic practice ranging from photography and collage to video installation and performance art. He has been widely exhibited internationally, and a solo exhibition spanning 3 decades is currently being presented at the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University, and lucky for us, we'll be traveling to the Queen's Museum, opening there next year. His work is included in numerous museum collections, and his wonderful book, Ektachrome Archive, was published by Aperture in 2017. Amy Sall is an educator, writer, editor, and collector based in New York. She is the founder and editor of SUNU, Journal of African Affairs, Critical Thought, and Aesthetics, a Pan-African digital platform exploring the multiple dimensions of Africa and the diaspora across various ideas and themes and time and space. As a part-time lecturer at the New School, she conceived and taught 2 courses, The African Gaze, Visual Culture of Post-Colonial Africa and the Social Imagination, and Third Cinema and the Counter-Narratives. Nana Ama Agyemang Asante is a journalist with over 10 years of experience covering politics and gender. Her most recent work was the Ghanaian Women Expert Project, which tracked the number of women experts interviewed in the media. She is currently based in New York City, where she is studying theology with a focus on human rights, gender, politics, and religion in Ghana. I had the pleasure of seeing Nana Ama on a wonderful panel in Accra about 1 year ago. Kwame Anthony Appiah is a philosopher and writer who has written about political philosophy, ethics, the philosophy of language and mind, and African intellectual history. Appiah was the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Philosophy at Princeton before moving to New York University in 2014. In addition to his numerous books, including In My Father's House and Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, Professor Appiah also writes the ethicist column for the New York Times Magazine. Aperture is a not-for-profit, and our programs and operations are made possible by the generosity of our Board of Trustees, our members, and other individuals, and with major support from foundations and government agencies, including the National Endowment for the Arts and the New York State Council on the Arts, with support from the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature. This program was also made possible by a generous donation from Elaine Goldman. I just want to mention that copies of the issue are available for purchase online. There's a QR code at the display table toward the entrance. And as a reminder, as Rob said, this is meant to be a forum, so we look forward to a conversation with the audience. Thank you, everyone, and I'll pass this over to our panel now.
Thank you, Michael, so much for the wonderful introduction. I'm just going to time myself since I tend to be long-winded and just give me a minute. I'm so happy my class is here this evening. We have class this evening, so this is the class, so classroom, so to speak. I I would like to thank my collaborator, Nia Badai. Nia Badai and I developed a profound and intellectual, I'm sorry he's not here this evening, but he's definitely here in spirit. Nia Badai and I developed a profound creative and intellectual connection since first meeting in Ghana in 2005. Along with his partner, Sarah and Sundi, he embraced me and offered a welcoming place in which I could find home there. Nee, the son of Accra's first mayor, is a worldly soul, and we made profound connection that was immediate and runs deep. He was instrumental in creating a space there that I could feel safe, which allowed me to be productive while teaching at NYU Accra, the global program, for over 7 years. Emerging from this connection and working closely with Michael and Brennan, the four of us explored our different points of view, articulating our strong conceptual concerns and individual commitments through an engagement, intellectual exchange to produce the Ghana issue, which was developed over the past year through multiple conversations in person, over Zoom, across locales spanning New York, Zimbabwe, London, Accra, and Italy. That's Nee and I at the Kempinski Hotel last August, and where I was seducing him into working in this issue. So, as you, for those of you who know him, is seriously elusive. So to get him pinned down is quite a feat. So we're super excited to have him collaborate with us on this issue. I particularly wanted to work with Nee on this issue, acknowledging the brilliance and humility of his deep philosophical commitment to reimagining how to represent the complexities of the contemporary African subject, exemplified by the development of his unique Nuku Studio project, which has been foundational in providing a creative space for young West African photographers in Northern Ghana. In 2005, I was invited to help develop the arts program of the newly established NYU Accra campus in Ghana by NYU's vice provost at the time, the Ghanaian economist Yao Nyarko, and my colleague and dear friend Nancy Barton, the former chair of the arts department of NYU Steinhardt School of Art and Art Professions. Nancy knew that as an adolescent in the mid-1970s, I had lived with my family in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, during Julius Nyerere's presidency as leader of that country's post-colonial independence movement, and that I was raised in the Bronx with a South African stepfather who had been living in exile from apartheid regime until its dismantling in the early 1990s. Both Yao and Nancy felt that given my experience, I could be of service to NYU and its students who traveled abroad to study and live in Africa for the first time. My one semester appointment turned to a 7-year immersive engagement with Ghana, having fallen in love with the people, the culture, and someone. I would say my full professorship at NYU is predicated on the creative practice, scholarly research, and service that I undertook while teaching and living in Ghana. Without question, my sojourn in Ghana was enriched by the literary and visual accounts of others who have immersed themselves in the historical, philosophical, aesthetic, ethical engagement with Ghana and the complexities and contradictions of African diaspora. I would like to evoke Richard Wright's Black Power, Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, Kwame Anthony Appiah, In My Father's House, Ekwa Oshun, Black Gold of the Sun, and more recently, Frankie Ndozo's Lives of Great Men, Living and Loving as an African Gay Man. In particular, that's my time, but I'll just take a couple minutes. In particular, it was Aperture's beloved master photographer, Paul Strand, seminal photographic monograph titled Ghana, an African Portrait, which he produced as a result of a personal invitation from Ghana's founding leading president, Nkrumah himself, that prompted me to propose Aperture Executive Director Sarah Miser the timelessness of producing an issue focusing on Ghana, followed up on the publication of Aperture's highly regarded issue platform 2000, which was done in 2017. So today I'll just take a couple of minutes to just share with you a selection of few photographs and artwork that I produced, and I'll go through them very quickly and we can engage them in the conversation. How does that sound? Great. So this was, it was actually the end of my first semester on my way back to New York when I checked what was junk mail at the time, and which I never do. And there was a prompt from my dear friend, Kathy Ryan of the New York Times to illustrate this story by the great Anthony Appiah. And little did he know that until he picked up the magazine that I was the one illustrating the story. So I traveled throughout Ghana from Kumasi to Tamale to Cape Coast, photographing various subjects wearing traditional outfits with technology. And I'll just say the prompt from the Times said, well, to photograph someone wearing a traditional outfit with a item of technology as if it was an anomaly. And so it was striking to me that even in 2005, whether it was the Times or Family, et cetera, was shocked to see these images as if, in fact, technology was much more pervasive in the continent. If you think about a lot of the women I was photographed were market women who were using telephones to compete, let's say, with fish women, market women in Togo. So I was very much aware that technology was being used in the global context. And it may seem strange from this vantage point from 23, but at that time it was part of this global idea that Anthony talked about in the book. But I'll quickly go through these and I can talk about it at length later, if you like. So the work fluctuates between a more journalistic and the personal, if you will. And I think that ranging from various archives, installations, to a most recent story on birding in Ghana, to the sitting First Lady that when I photographed her, plus other members of the Ghanaian society, she in 2005 at a Malaria Foundation board. So I'll just end with this last two slides. And as Anthony knows, that when I was in Ghana my first semester, with my driver, I happened upon the cover of the Daily Guide, which is equivalent, I guess, would be the Post, would it not? Yes. And with this title, and just thinking of the archive, what it meant to register a level of trauma and to take that newspaper clipping and to reactivate it for this particular issue. But we can bring that up in the discussion later. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for the response back. It is so wonderful to be here amongst you all. Thank you to Aperture for the kind invitation. I'm very excited to be in conversation with my highly esteemed co-discussants. I'm going to try to keep my presentation brief, which is not always possible when talking about my work, but here we are, we'll try. So tonight I'm going to be talking about SUNU, Journal of African Affairs, Critical Thought and Aesthetics. Yes, it is a mouthful. It is a project and platform that I founded in 2015. And part of the inspiration to develop this platform and project has a lot to do with the archive. On my personal Instagram, dating back to 2012, I would post things like film stills, archival African photography. And it was really interesting, the kind of conversations and questions that were coming up in the comments section. And so I thought, okay, there's great interest in such material, but there really isn't a formal space to talk about such material, especially from people of my age and my generation who are coming into the archive, but don't necessarily know how to access these kinds of materials. And so in thinking about what this platform, what this space could look like, firstly, let me back up. Let's define what Sunu is. Sunu is the word hour in Wolof, the dialect that's commonly spoken in Senegal. I am of Senegalese descent, but it really is a pan-African platform for cultivating, and archiving ideas concerning global Blackness across multiple forms and themes. And this is why the title of the journal is so long, because I wanted to come up with a name that encapsulates almost everything. I didn't want it to be a singular discipline. It's not the Journal of Photography, it's not the Journal of Writing, but of multiple forms, multiple themes. In fact, I like to refer to Sunu as a post-disciplinary platform. So back to my earlier point about envisioning what this platform could look like, how this can exist in the world, I referred back to publications of the past that set the precedent for African thought and critical thinking. Publications such as Présence Africaine, Tropiques, The Black Scholars, Soufflé, Black Orpheus, Rêve Noir, and the list can go on. These are just a few to name, and I am, proudly saying that Sunu stands on the shoulders of such publications and the creators of these publications. So Sunu Journal sort of operates on two different planes. As I mentioned, we have the Instagram, which acts as its own archival project, but I always want to be careful when discussing social media and the archive, because social media is very much this amorphous, nebulous, wild, wild west of the internet. And when we're talking about the archive, you always want to approach it with an ethic of care and honor the archival methodologies that exist. So Sunu, even though it is this beautiful archival project of photographs and film stills and literature, it's still, I'm always cognizant of the fact that it exists within this very nebulous world where there's theft, there's all kinds of things that happen on social media, but Sunu Journal does its best to always honor the works that we feature. We always provide the pertinent information, the name of the artist, the dates, whatever information is available, so that we can establish and provide the provenance, and also allow those who are interested in doing their own further research into some of the materials that we share, that they have direction to go in. Just to point out what we have on the screen, we have a beautiful photograph by Daniel Atumu Amachia. I really apologize if I'm butchering any names in this presentation, who is was a Ghanaian photographer, but practiced largely in Grand Bassam, Ivory Coast. We also have a beautiful portrait of a photograph by James Barner. Here we have a photograph by Malik Sidibe and one by Samle Sori of Burkina Faso. And this is just a very zoomed out sample of what you can find on the Sunu Journal Instagram, going back to 2014 or 2015. But as you can see, it's an array of material. We have, like I mentioned before, film stills, photographs, public figures, literary figures, political figures, you name it. It really is an array of material that spans across all kinds of disciplines and themes. To bring it to the actual platform, sunujournal.com, I wanted to highlight a few of our contributing photographers, as the discussion is focused on photography this evening. We have Yodit Damlash, who is an Ethiopian American photographer. We also have Lloyd Foster, who's a Ghanaian photographer. We have Usman Sow, Senegalese American. We have Malcolm Teferi Sow, Burkinabe Canadian, no relation, just same last names. And then when thinking about writing about the photographic archive, these are two examples of some of the written material that you can find on Sunu Journal. Again, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm only focusing on photography. So, in thinking about thoughts surrounding the photographic archive, these are just a couple of examples of ways that we can talk about and think about African photography. And I think I was also saying, just for the purposes of this presentation, I'm only focusing on photography, but on SUNU journal.com, you can find all kinds of written works about all kinds of ideas and themes relating to Africa and the diaspora. So we have a beautiful piece by Miller Bianucci on the work of Ernest Cole of South Africa. And we have another brilliant piece by Dalia El Hassan, who is looking at Sudanese photography and the Sudanese gaze. And so that is SUNU Journal in a nutshell. Thanks, you all.
I didn't bring any pictures because I didn't have a New York Times editor to pick a photographer for me. I loved those photographs that you did, Lyle, and they didn't tell me that you were doing them, and you didn't tell me either. So it was great to open the magazine and see them, and to find photographs which so brilliantly underlined the argument in the text, which is something that photographs can do but often don't, because it's very hard. And it was kind of, I think if you had asked me for my thoughts before you took the pictures, you wouldn't have got anything better than you did, because in a way, what that combination I think showed was the ways in which different kinds of thinking can nevertheless come together to achieve an understanding of the question, which in that case was this sense of Ghana as a place that many Americans sort of would think about as belonging outside modernity in a certain way, and to insist on the absolute presentness and modernity of Ghana, both through a set of arguments, but also through these images, which made the point very, very directly. I wanted to as well underline one point that is made at the point in this issue of the journal that seems to me a really important framing point for thinking about photography in Ghana today, which is just the point that, you know, I'm very ancient. I'm probably the eldest person in this room, and when I was growing up, photographs were expensive, especially studio photographs, which were a thing, which maybe they aren't anymore. So there was the sampling of life that you get in the photographs from the period when I was a kid, which is 50s and 60s, and especially the sampling of the photographs that have survived from that period, is a very class-skewed sample. And so you don't really get a sense of lots of things about what life was like in Kumasi, the city that I grew up in the 1950s, if you just, as it were, looked at the photographs that are easily available to you. You wouldn't have, and that's in part, you know, for the money and those sorts of reasons, but in part because a lot of the people who were sort of taking photographs weren't particularly interested in a way, the most interesting things about my city, which were things that were going on the street with regular people who were not being lifted up in these representations. I wish I had known before this evening, and it's an astonishing piece of ignorance on my part, about the Paul Strand thing. I have some Paul Strand photographs, and I admire Paul Strand, and just have never connected him with Ghana. And yet that bringing of the world to Ghana was something, and he's an instance of, but that was a very important part of what Nkrumah did in the first decade of Ghanaian independence. He was there. I mean, independence is 1957, 1966, he's removed by a coup. So it's nearly 10 years, but they were very important years in terms of these issues. And I noticed in one of your big constellations of photographs. For example, there was a picture of Maryse Condé, who we think of as a Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean francophone writer. She was in Ghana at that point. She was brought to Ghana. And the other day I was up at the Schomburg, and along with collections of the of work that are now in the archive there. There are photographs because Maya Angelou, in the Angelou archive, there are photographs and postcards, and letters from her period in Ghana. So there was a very now Strand was not a black person, so the people that Nkrumah brought to Ghana were not all African diaspora. He brought all kinds of people. There were Hungarian architects. My parents' house was built by a Hungarian architect. There were obviously people from we were non-aligned, so there were Russians and Yugoslavs and at the university and so on. And that openness to the world with which we began is a continuation of a kind of openness to the world that I think Lyle would agree is just one of the bizarre features of Ghana, that it's a country which, for whatever reason, is enormously open to and generous to strangers in a way that's, that's a good thing to be, and people often think good things about the places that they came from. But this is objectively true, that it's a nicer, more welcoming place than some of its neighbors. And I think it's a great question for social science, why that is. But part of it is this connection with the world, which is a very long thing. I mean, the first Europeans to sort of spend time and build buildings on the coast of Ghana. That's in the 16th century, and the prosperous people, often the rulers and so on, sent people to Europe to explore and to figure out what these strange people were up to. And the first Ghanaian to get the first person from the Gold Coast to get a PhD in philosophy got it in 1720 or so. His name was Anton Wilhelm Amu. He was called Anton Wilhelm because the Duke, who was his godfather, had two sons called Anton and Wilhelm, and he named him after his own sons, and he raised them with his own sons. He educated them with his own sons, and he got degrees in law and philosophy and taught a bit and was a rector at a university and a lecturer, and then went home and retired to Ghana. So that connection with the world is something that that was involuntary. He was probably enslaved and then given to these dukes, and his brother ended up as a slave in Suriname. But so we've been connected with the world. The idea of Africa as a place that sort of discovered the world in when it was colonized. That's a really bad idea. I like to remind people that Cape Coast Castle, which is a building that people often visit, was when it was British, the British were paying rent. It was not a colonial construction. They paid rent to the local Fanti chief who gave them the land. And the colonial governor in the 18th century, there's a famous discussion in Parliament. He comes to report to Parliament. It turns out that he had never been more than, I think, 10 miles inland because he didn't feel safe. So again, these connections with the world were made from Ghana's, from the Gold Coast side. They weren't imposed upon us. And it's true that in the 20th century, my hometown was finally conquered by the British, but that was in the 20th century. So our connections with the world were made by us, as it were, primarily. And those connections were not just with Europe. They were obviously into Africa and into the Arab world. But to return to the point that I started with and to end with it, one of the exciting things about photography now in Ghana is the way in which it's much less a sampling of elite life, and much, though there were some fine contemporary photographs of presidents' wives and so on in this on the screen just now. But those pictures that Lyle took were regular folk. I mean, some of them were very prosperous because they were successful businesswomen, but they were not rulers and mistresses of the world. They were regular folk going about their business, and I think you get a much better picture of Ghana now, and this is of course a point that's completely general, than you did from the pictures that were the ones that were around when I was a kid, like this one, which is in Nkrumah with my parents.
Hi. So I had a whole presentation put together, and you know how they say you should print everything? I got here, I couldn't connect to the internet, so we're gonna do this from here, and we'll see. We'll see how I do. Very happy to be here. Grateful to Aperture for this moment. So I could tell you about what I do in Ghana. I'm a journalist. For the last 8 years, I co-hosted a popular political morning show. And then upended my life and came to New York to study religion because American evangelical Christians have taken over my country, and I want to resist. So that's what I do. We could talk about that later, but I want to talk about the piece I wrote for the Accra issue of Aperture, and tell you why I think market women, the Makola women, are special, but Ghanaian market women are essential and special and hold such a dear place in my heart. So here goes. Now somebody has to teach me. Oh, okay. So this is a picture of our president, current president, with some of his ministers. We can count the women, right? We could go back to 3 presidents before him and look for pictures of those presidents with their appointees, and the pictures would be similar. There would be fewer women. In this government of 85 ministers, only 8 are women. We could go to parliaments where out of the 275 representatives, only 40 are women. Then there's this picture. This is a famous picture. Professor Appiah has met some of those men. They're the big 6. It is said that these men liberated our country from British colonial rule. I don't know how 6 men can do that, but every independence anniversary, this picture and versions of it whipped up, published, splashed on billboards, on TV, everywhere. They are even on our currencies. It is said that they liberated us. And when these are the images that exist, plus the numbers of women in government, there's a dominant narrative that says African women are oppressed and have no agency, and all of those things. They're all true. We are underrepresented in the decision-making process and everything. But I grew up in the city. Prof grew up in Kumasi. And if you come from a prominent household, you see women have power and they assert it. And you see that it's not just classed or educated women who have power. It's women in what is called the informal sector. So those women will be, some of those women will be these women, the women who work in Makola. This is a picture of the market, the Makola market. So it will be the women who work in these markets. And the reason I wanted to write about the market women or the Makola market women, it's that they shape our lives. They are the ones that decide what we wear, what we eat, what we drink. They have built elaborate distribution systems across the country. And as the mother market, so Makola market is in the capital, Accra, which is the coast. So it's close to the harbor. So they decide These people would need deodorants. These people would need fish. These people would need fabrics. It's elaborate and sophisticated. And they've done this for generations. So the Makola Markets was built in 1925. It was previously dominated by the women indigenous to Accra. And they built this sophisticated apprenticeship and distribution system, plus marketing techniques. So for instance, the cloths you saw in Lyle's pictures, the traditional clothing, they named them to fit whatever is happening in the country. So if somebody dies, I think in Lyle's last picture, there was a saying above one of the pictures that says, it's in my language, which is Chi, which says death destroys the household. And so this is what people would go and buy. And these women are so smart that they decide to tie the name of a cloth to an event that is happening. And so this is what people do. They decide what we do. It's not government policy. It's not state policy. It is these market women that ensure that there is enough for us to eat. They train people. So there are barriers to, in a country, a developing country, despite what they say. They say we're middle income. I haven't experienced it. So in a country that is what there are barriers to employment where we are not yet industrialized, they create access for other people who are not educated to have jobs and to survive. And because they've done this, they've created a space where they have power. Some of them have have amassed wealth. It's across class lines because, people from elite families go into trading and so they establish themselves. But there's just such a low barrier to entry. You can start from hawking and over the years build up, exchange labor for capital and then build a whole business. And I think that is tremendous. So Miss Fa, that's the photographer, about two pictures of these women in Makola. This woman sells tomatoes and she's done it for over 16 years, I think, just selling tomatoes. That's how she put her children through school. That's what they do. The cloth I was talking about, these, they name them, we buy them, we use them. That's what we do. We don't do a lot of Western style. We love color and we love to express our emotions in cloth as well. So they help us make those decisions. And for that, whenever there is inflation, is for those who are following the news, our economy has sort of crashed. Our currency is the worst performing currency after Burma, I think. And for that, for being people who are this sophisticated, who control the market spaces, who have power, whenever the government hits a snag, guess who they go for? The market women. And so right now that inflation is high, they are to blame. In 1979, Makola Markets was razed to the ground by the military regime. The women were blamed for corruption, for hiding what was then framed as essential commodities. This would be drugs, milk, soap, bread, flour, you name it. They were to blame for that. The government had not built any distribution system. It had not stored. It does not have warehouses. But these women who were doing what they could to make sure the country flourished, they were to blame. Some were shot. Their homes were seized. People's children were taken from them. It was bloody. Thankfully, this time around that the economy has crashed, it's just social media anger and ministers pointing fingers. Nobody has gone into anybody's home to just uproot them and shove them into some guard room. This would be, we wear beads and we eat lots of fish. And so they would, when I say they ensure that our lives work, we love fish, but the fish do not arrive like this. So it's somebody's job to smoke it, to make sure that those who do not live in the coast have access to this. It's brilliant. And I, for one, I am glad they exist. They are not part of what is deemed as the formal sector where people like me or journalists or nurses or doctors dominate. And we, as educated as we are, having found a way to create power for ourselves, but they, in the spaces that is deemed, informal, where they are not as educated, have carved a space for themselves where they look after themselves, they give loans to themselves, they support each other. I was at a different market a few years ago where they had set up kindergarten, so that women traders who had children would feel okay to put their children there. They would have care, and they would go to to do their trading business. I think that without them, I don't know how Ghanaians would have gotten by. They're the real backbone of the economy, despite what our Minister of Finance says. So this is why I wanted to write about the Makola women. For me, they're representative of market women across Ghana who ensure that the economy survives. It's not because of any government ingenuity, but the ingenuity of these brilliant, brilliant, wonderful women. Thank you.
If there are any questions, yes.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for your lovely presentations. I had a question.
Maybe you should identify yourself.
I'm Varun. I'm the managing editor of the magazine. So I got to work with all of you on the issue. Something that Michael mentioned that's also in the intro that Nee talked about was this idea about how photographs are a potent medium for situating history. All of you in some way or the other talked about archives or archival material. I was curious about your relationship to archival material and how and photographic archives and how that's informed your relationship to Accra's recent history or broken it open, helped you think about it and revisit it in ways. I know, Lyle, you mentioned the clipping from the Daily Guide or the Big Six, How have these materials specifically helped you think about the history?
I was having a conversation. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, Kaylee. When I got in, and I was telling her that I think it's impossible to understand the present without going back to the past. And for me, somebody who grew up in Kumasi, who went to festivals, was dragged to things, not that I wanted to, sort of looking back at that period through pictures, it's helping me recognize that, oh, we have changed. We used to be this way, because often when people are talking, they would say things like, is this Nkrumah's Ghana? And it's not based on anything. It's based on, Nkrumah is a bit deified. And so they have all these understandings of a saint and of a time when Ghana was perfect. And having access to archival material and those images help us challenge these notions of perfection or of a time when we had better government or we were different. We have changed, but not everything is as a result of that perfect period. So for me, it just helps me challenge certain narratives. It helps me understand the present. I'm studying religion right now. And because the archives exist, I can go back and look at pictures of preachers and recognize that, oh, there were people who were anti the colonial government. There are people from the dominant mission churches who sided with Nkrumah and the liberation movement. So it wasn't just Nkrumah or the Big Six, but it was also the churches working to sort of liberates the country. I also know that by looking at the pictures or listening to audio tapes, I know what sermons were preached, that they were not all prosperity gospel. So for me, the archives have been immensely helpful in helping me understand my present, but also understand what was happening then and what has led us to this moment. Thank you.
I guess I'll take a stab at this question. As I was listening to Nana speak, I realized that we have a few things in common in terms of our philosophies and being, I always say that I'm Afro-past, because in order for me to understand my present and my future, I always look back to the past, which is why I included the examples of those publications such as Presence African, because I always look back to those who came before in order to ground myself in the present and to know how to move forward. When I think about my relationship to the photographic archive, I think it probably starts in just looking at family photo albums, excuse me. But I think I really started engaging with the archive seriously and more intellectually, probably in grad school. I was studying human rights, and I would often look to African films specifically to contextualize a lot of the human rights theories and ideas and frameworks that I was studying. For example, issues on youth unemployment or FGM. There is an African film out there on all of these different topics, and I would go to those films, pieces of cinema, to sort of just help me understand what it was I was understanding, or some of the things that I was reading in these textbooks and in some of these materials. But in terms of the photographic archive, it was just this interest. I would go to galleries. I specifically remember, I think it was 2014, there was an exhibition on Samuel Fosso's work at the Walter Collection, and just trips to galleries and museums just started to broaden my horizons about key pioneering figures within the context of African photography. And then I started to sort of think deeply about who are the people and the institutions sort of mediating and controlling such archives. And every time I would look, try to trace the provenance of a photo or understand where I can learn more about a particular photograph, it was always in a private collection or an institution that was controlled and owned by someone who was not African. And so the archive sort of broadened and opened myself up to questions about ownership. And it's interesting that the conversation about repatriation is, sort of circulating, because that's something that I'm thinking about in relation to the photograph. Like, who are owning these photographs? Why do they get to own them? Why do they get to exhibit them in a particular way? Should they go back to where they came from? All these questions. And so I think my relationship to the archive is always evolving and deepening and stretching. And I'm always trying to hold myself accountable to ensure that whatever work that I'm doing with relationship to African cinema or photography is always grounded, as I mentioned earlier, in an ethic of care. And so that I'm not making the same mistakes that I observe other people making. And I'll just leave it at that.
So much to share. I was thinking about Nana's showing the photograph of the Big Six, and during pandemic, there was a wonderful documentary. I think it was on Netflix. It might have been Criterion Channel, on the history of Nigeria. And they actually documented, there was a whole segment on not the Big Six of Nigeria, but it was the market women who actually ignited, let's say, a critique of colonialism. In fact, when I think it was the British officers were somehow challenging them, they literally physically fought back. So I think it's important to talk about, there may not be photographs out there might be, but the fact how those oral stories and histories, it was the market women who actually challenged the British officers, let's say, in Nigeria. And so I'm curious if a similar thing happened, let's say, to your point, I think it will also happen in Ghana. So I think it's important to constantly, and that's what was important about this issue when I was talking with Neil Badai, Michael and Brennan, just in terms of those who are telling the stories inside this issue. So it's important for me that there were women voices, there were women photographers, and that was essential. I remember when I was in Kumasi and part of this conference was taking place, I said, I will not do this conference without having a female theorist come in, and they flew Sanamo Kujato in from Basel at the time. So I think it's how you curate, how you choose to construct. And even in this issue, it's important to have multiple voices, but also to have the voice of, let's say, Frankie Ndozo to talk about the absence of queer space. So what does it mean in this particular issue to have the First Lady who just bought 10 copies of the issue, and she also has to deal with the narration of queer space in Ghana. Now, she may know Chester, who's her best friend, bestie, but what does it mean to have a story that actually archives the history of queer space? That's when I think we begin to reimagine those spaces. So it's not just in a public realm or in the newspaper where one could actually, in the context of a magazine, where one could ponder and to reflect. So I think that's another way of thinking about how do we curate these archives, I mean, for me. I also think it'd be interesting, to your point, in terms of like in Kumasi during when you were a child, that only a certain social class. But that's when I think we need to look at the work of, let's say, the late Alan Sekula, to look at the police archives, to look at other forms of archives which are maybe not the bourgeois portraits, but often images of discursive ways of other narratives. So I think we have to open up that space. We're thinking about what are the counter narratives that may not fall in the bourgeois notion of the portrait that may offer documentation and histories. So I just want to, and I think since the inception of photography, there was that particular trajectory of the portraiture, but also photography was implicated in anthropology. As we know, ethnography, we all know this in criminology. So those archives could be unpacked. And that means moving beyond a respectability politics. If you think about on the eve of, let's say, independence, of the 50th anniversary of independence in 2007, where several of the prisoners were moved from Jamestown prison as they were going through this beautification of the coast, if you will. I got in there and got those collages of the men, and you could see tropes of desire. And I mean, these are collages that were fixed directly into the wall. Was it, they clearly didn't have elements of glue. So was it saliva? Was it semen? I mean, how did those men who were imprisoned visualize their desire? So I think it's important for us to be thinking out of the box around what we mean and when we think about the archive, if that makes any sense.
I'll just say, I mean, just a couple footnotes. I mean, one is that the market women were very important in the CPP and in Nkrumah's political party, the Convention People's Party. So they were definitely part of the independence movement, and not just the CPP actually, because the leading opposition party to Nkrumah was and it was sort of based in the Akan parts of Ghana, so not on the coast, but that too, I mean, the money, these women had money, and they participated in the debates in the party about what policy should be and so on. So I don't think, and in fact, the market in the town we grew up in, Kumasi, was the largest market in West Africa at one point. Okay, and it's going. I mean, it's ancient because it's built on the system of the 8 roads that the Asante Empire used to go in every direction down to the coast, up into the Sahel, east into what's now Togo and west into what's now Ivory Coast, and huge amount of trade in West Africa, and women dominated, especially in foodstuffs. There's a great book actually about the central market in Kumasi. It's called "Onions Are My Husband."
Oh, yeah.
It's about the social organization of the market by these. They're called queen mothers. There's the onion queen mother and the tomato queen mother and the yam queen mother and so on. But they're organizing very, very complicated trade networks. They're organizing the stuff from the farms into the cities where people can eat it. And you can get rich that way if you do it properly, and they often do. And so they're very important historically. I think. I mean, there is something weird going on in Ghana at the moment around sort of queer issues, because there's this horrendous bill going through the parliament, which is going to criminalize saying you're gay. It's going to criminalize knowingly having gay people in your house and so on. Now, who knows whether any of that would actually be implemented. And of course, gay sex has been illegal in Ghana since colonial times. So, and there's not a lot of prosecutions, but the prosecutions there are all going to be of regular people. They're not going to be They're going to be lawyers who get prosecuted, or members of parliament. And this is connected with your issue, right? This is connected with the role of American evangelical Christians in reshaping sort of gender and sexuality politics, not just in Ghana. Obviously, it's happened. I mean, similar things have happened in Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria it's a crime in Nigeria to be gay married. Despite the fact that one of the leading senators who put that through has a gay son. So there you are. So I think this connection between this current way of being connected to the world is very, very, it's both depressing, but also, like many depressing things, very interesting theoretically.
Is this being recorded or no? Yeah. Okay, great. Speaking of the archive, no, I think it'd be helpful to your point, Nan, if you can just explain, because this is an international audience, but we are located in the US, that people understand in a very explicit way how we are implicated in terms of the US, in terms of the, not only in Uganda, but also my understanding that pre-COVID, right before COVID, there were millions of dollars. I think it'd be important to talk about the role of religion. American evangelists have shifted that discourse in God, which was, to your point, which is much more open. But the fact now there has been an acceleration. I think it'd be important for this going.
Just as a piece of background here, it's worth quoting my father, who was a Methodist. He was a Methodist elder, whose view about gay sex was, when he was asked, was, well, of course I can see why men might have sex with one another. Sex is pleasurable.
Yeah. And I think Asante was quite open. So I'll share the story. My father passed in 2016. He was a chief. And at his funeral, it was a big funeral, there were trans women dancing the traditional dance at his funeral. I say this to show that just 2016, gender non-conforming Ghanaians could exist in my part of Ghana and move freely and participate in traditions. And there was no judgment. There was no violent rhetoric. There had been, I think, since maybe 2006, when the charismatic Christianity sort of became mainstream. If you follow the news, you would hear they used to call it a gay menace. So every now and then somebody will be arrested. It will be big news. There was an uproar over some conference that international gay people were going to gather in Accra. That sort of blew up for days, to the point that the Minister for Interior banned the so-called conference that was being organized by unnamed people. We didn't know who was going to organize this conference, but they announced the ban because the church was in a frenzy. People were agitated. And that sort of shift has been sort of building up. But right around 2018, just before 2018, this group called the National Coalition for Proper Family Values, funded by American evangelical groups such as Family Watch International, World Congress for Family, sort of announced that they were going to make sure a law is passed to criminalize homosexuality. Mind you, no gay person in Ghana had asked for marital rights. Nobody had asked for anything. This was out of the blue for us. 2 years later, World Congress for Families, which is based here and in Russia, came to Ghana, held a conference where friends of mine went, so I have a transcript of some of the things that they were plotting, basically to get a law passed by lobbying traditional leaders, religious leaders across the religion. So this is not just Christians doing it. but Ghana is 70% of Ghanaians identify as Christians, so the church has immense power. So lobby the Christians, they're already in, lobby the Muslims, lobby traditional leaders. In fact, make it seem that this is against traditional African values, which is pro-children. So their understanding is that if somebody is queer, they're not going to have children. Even though we as Ghanaians know that there are many forms of family, we have different ways of organizing family. And so this conference happens maybe 6 months after the conference, which was funded by these American groups. A bill was written named after the conference, which at the time criminalized everything from sympathy for gay people. So if I went on radio and I said, this person who was lynched here broke my heart, I could go to jail for 10 years for saying that. For having gay sex, you could go to jail for 5 years. If you were found with sex toys in your house, you were going to jail. If parents refused to report their children who were queer, they were going to jail. And they were going to compel intersex Ghanaians to undergo surgery, sort of to fit the binary gender. It's a whole array of things, but it ranges from sympathy to gay sex to, criminalizing basically the existence of queer people. But not just that, just affection between same-sex, same-gendered people, even that is now PDA, is now a crime. So if I hug my sister, who I have missed when I get to Ghana, if this bill passes, both my sister and I could go to jail. And what this has done is sort of changed the way we related to each other. So queer people who have lived in communities for years, there was a story of a young man who was beaten in a community that is 8 hours from the capital. And when he was interviewed, he said, I've lived here, this is where I was born, I have a shop, and they call me Obaya. Oba means woman. Ya is the name given to women born on Thursday. So he so effeminate that the members of the community have given him a name. He has not given himself a name, but they recognize that he's not conforming to, even though, he's supposed to be a man, he doesn't conform to that gender. They recognize that, have always extended care to him. But due to this shift, some people sort of waylaid him, basically lynched him. He was dragged to the chief's palace. This is a thing we don't do. They said he had brought shame and abomination to the land, slaughtered a ram, did the whole thing. But I'm saying this to say that the people whose lives who are really experiencing violence are people who are already poor and living on the margins of society. So it's not, when Lyle was talking, he said, Chester, who has not said he's queer, but we all know because he was on TV, is best friends with the First Lady. Nobody's going to harm Chester, but people who are living in communities outside the center are in great danger, not just from members of their community who have become extremely fundamentalist, but even from the police. So now young men going out at night, all the police have to say to extort money from you is to claim they caught you having sex. Basically, in my research and understanding of what is happening is American evangelicals feeling they have lost ground here have sort of moved the fight to my country, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Uganda, all those other countries, Kenya, we sort of changed who we used to be and created this really toxic environment where it's not safe for me as a woman, it's not safe for queer people. In fact, there's a bill that passed 2 years ago, on the blind side of most Ghanaians, that sort of says if there's a road accident and a pregnant woman dies, the driver will be charged with manslaughter for killing 2 people. You will think it's good, except they take the source from Kentucky, Texas, all those places. And the way I see it is they're going for queer people. They've already said they will come for abortion, and we don't know what next. So basically, if there are progressives in here, I need you to do your work and leave my country alone. Thank you.
Amy, did you want to talk about, I was thinking about the journal. Oh, I'm sorry, please. Please. Can they stand so we can recognize them?
I was a student at the University of Ghana, so while leadership studied over one of our assignments politics that we had New York Times article assigned to us, and also the book that was coming out around the time. So it's very interesting to all these that have these strands together, and I really appreciate your contribution to the issue, and also because you can. So my question actually is about options, and it's for you, Robin, you, Amy, and I but over the last 2 years. So your ideas around politics kind of change because of the rise of social media and specifically the way you think about photographs. I was very intrigued by this anecdote that you showed us. Sometimes I realize you caption very carefully in this, and then we just fell on images. And I was just thinking about what it might be like to be a young person in Dakar or in Barcelona or whatever, and messaging people across spaces and sharing images like that. Do you think that there's a new sense of cosmopolitanism that has been propelled by social media and photography, or the simplistic way of thinking about it?
I guess the best way that I can answer that question is that it's really illuminated how wonderful and I guess now here it is to be connected to so many people across ocean spaces. I think one of the joys of running and operating the SUNY Journal Instagram is that there have been a number of instances where people would message me or message the account and say, oh, and let's say it's a reference to a studio portrait. They'd say, this is a photograph of my aunt, or this is a photograph of my grandfather, or this is, some of these really beautiful familial connections would emerge from what we can all just simplify as just like social media, but some really interesting and important things are happening. So I'm not sure if it's a new form of cosmopolitanism, but I think it's just, I don't know, there's a microscope, and it's just enlarging this idea of like how connected we are in ways that we don't really take into consideration. If that makes sense.
Yes. So, I mean, I think one thing to say is that there's a thing that happens. There's always which gets accelerated in the World Wide Web. I think the example I gave in the book was not about an image, but about a Coca-Cola can. In some places in the world, that's a prestige object. And so offering someone Coke is offering them something, is a sign of respect. In other places, it's just a soda that somebody's drinking. So when images circulate, they can often acquire very surprising meanings. And that happens at an accelerated rate on the web, I think. So that, I mean, probably the most famous example of this in West Africa is it looks like the origins of some of the symbolic representations of Mami Wata, who's a West African, and I say West African because she's found in, not just in Ghana, but in all along the coast. It looks like that the original images that shaped the way, and you can find her painted on buildings and trucks and things all over West Africa. And there are shrines to her, and there are specific things that she's supposed to be good at getting, if you make offerings at her shrine. It looks like the original imagery comes from some, I believe, from some circulating images of Hindu gods that were circulated among South Asian migrants who were working in trade in West Africa. And they got read as goddesses, African gods. And so now sort of what Mami Wata looks like borrows from an image that was circulated for an entirely different set of reasons from around the world. Well, you can imagine, that involved actually physically taking postcards from India to, East Africa and then circulating them across Africa and so on. That can happen like that now. And so I think people sort of consume images, both still and moving images, in ways that are somewhat disconnected often from their original, from the senders or the creators' meanings and intentions in a very interesting way. I'd say, the other thing that the web has made possible, which is relevant to the earlier part of the conversation, is solidarities across the world. So queer people in Africa now can find each other, not just in their countries, but across countries. They can also find allies outside Africa. And also they can find imaginary possibilities which are not made available to them at home. And they may not be free to explore them because they may get beaten up if they try to explore them, or worse. But at least they have a kind of liberation of the mind, which is possible. The worry is that governments will start policing that, but right now they're not doing that, and so it remains the case that for the persecuted gay people in many African countries who are being persecuted as a result of these evangelical adventures, they have a virtual place where they can try and build solidarities that are
Is it on? Hello? It's on. I think it's important just to say, to your point, not as point that it wasn't just queer people, but it's the homogenization of spheres of intimacy that's being impacted. Because outside of the West, you could have two men, if they were straight, have a level of intimacy, he's holding hands, or two women. And that is what is being impacted in a larger sense.
So
that's important to
talk
about.
No.
It's not just colonizing queer people, but also
it's changing everything.
Intimacies, etc. I think it's important to
No, that's completely right. So among Nkrumah was Nzima, and Nzima people had an institution of male-male marriage, which was not sexual. It wasn't about. It was about precisely intimate friendship between young men who then went on to marry women. What they did would now be would be what they normally did, and which everybody understood and accepted, would now be criminalized. So it's changing, and as you said, and this was, everybody should remember from the history of queer persecution in this country. You don't have to be gay to be gay bashed, and you don't have to be gay to be prosecuted as gay or accused of being gay. And so what gets policed is any kind of indication of same-gender intimacy. I do not know how they can really enforce this in Ghana, because it's just so, it'd be fascinating to see, it's horrible, all right, but it is also interesting to figure out how they're going to do this when, given the way people actually normally relate to one another. I just don't see how you can. What will happen is again, only powerless people will ever get into trouble, because when I went to see my uncles when I was a young man, I took them by the hand and we walked around the house together. You know, no, he was the king of Asante, so nobody was going to prosecute him. But it's going to be.
I did have a unrelated question for Amy in regards to the House of Bondage. So was that a link? Could you just walk us through? Was that a photograph? Was that I guess to Brenda's point, what was that exactly?
That was an essay that a young scholar named Milucci wrote on the. Yeah, and in the writing, she did go through House of Bondage, discussing that book in particular, but like more so what Ernest Cole meant to South African visual culture and how brave he was, because a lot of photography coming from Black South Africans were or was censored because, you know, the state wanted to quell what was actually going on. And so in that piece, which you can read on SUNYjournal.com, it highlights the work of Ernest Cole, his bravery, and what his work meant and in terms of apartheid.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I mean, I went to see.
Lyle. We hear, of course.
Go to that because there's a wonderful show that Remy curated at the Momo in the House of Bondage, and I was seeing it with my good friend and student Benji, and he was concerned that some students of his generation are not even aware of apartheid. So I'm just wondering, speaking of your point in terms of questions, in terms of the archive, how do we activate those recent histories? You know, my father knew Ernest Cole. You know, Ernest Cole died in destitute in South Africa, in New York. So that was a book that was part of my home in the Bronx. But I'm just thinking about, for this next generation of students, how do we transmit this information? So, for example, this is an example in terms of doing it, but I'm trying to think, how do we activate it, and how does that relate to institutions such as the Modern, for example, now staging the show? Because it was fascinating just seeing how people were engaged with the work as if they were approaching it, let's say, for the first time. So,
yeah, well, actually, if I could just encourage us, we have a wonderful array of drinks and snacks outside. And part of the purpose of this really is to create an opportunity for informal exchange about House of Bondage, which Aperture recently re-released with an essay by Remy Onabanjo. I'm Sarah Meister, by the way. I'm the executive director. And so with Rob, I just want to thank all of you for bringing so much to this conversation tonight. I'd really like to congratulate Lyle and Nee and Varun and Brendan and Michael on an extraordinary issue of the magazine. I'm very proud to be a part of Aperture at the moment in which that is brought into the world. And I have lots of questions about the competition between words and images and more. So I hope we all bring all our questions out and enjoy them over a glass of wine in the Great Hall. Thank you all for being here tonight.